Hello and welcome to this video on voting behavior, the long-term factors, as we call them, behind voting behavior. So since psephology, that is the study of elections and voting behavior, really got underway in the late 1940s, psephologists have identified a number of trends in voting patterns. Links have been made between voting behavior and membership of particular social groupings. In particular, psephologists have identified links between voting behavior and class, region, gender, age, and ethnicity. These demographic factors influencing voting behavior are often known as long-term factors and are associated with what's called primacy theory, which emphasizes these long-term factors as the most important in influencing voting behavior. And this lecture will look at each of these long-term factors in turn. So first of all, social class. Each of the three main parties in the UK, or at least in England, that is the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, have their roots in a particular class. The Conservatives were traditionally associated with the landowning class, the gentry or aristocracy or nobility. The Liberals were associated with the bourgeoisie, the merchant class of business owners, whilst Labour, having been set up by the trade unions in 1900, were associated with the working class. During the 19th century, as the power of the nobility began to decline, the Conservatives refashioned themselves as a bourgeois party, and since the early 20th century, the UK has effectively had a two-party system, with the Conservatives representing the middle and upper classes and Labour representing the working class. For most of the 20th century, there was a clear link between social class and voting behaviour, with those in classes A, B and C1 far more likely to vote Conservative than Labour, whilst the reverse was true for classes D and E. In the 1997 election, for example, 3 times as many voters from classes D and E voted Labour than Conservative, whilst 50% more A and B voters voted Conservative than Labour. Incidentally, those in class 2, the skilled manual workers, have never had such a strong attachment to either of the main parties and have always been more likely to be so-called swing voters, changing their vote from one election to the next. And for this reason, it's often this group, the C2s, that actually determines the outcome of elections, and which therefore are particularly targeted by election campaigns. Nevertheless, for the other classes, the correlation between social class and voting behaviour, known as class alignment, was throughout the 20th century very strong. Now, 2 main explanations have been given for this correlation. One explanation concerns identity. Some people identify as middle class or upper class, and due to the historic association between those classes and the Conservative Party, voting Conservative is part of their class identity. Similarly, and perhaps even more so for Labour, for those who identified as working class, voting for Labour, the party of the working class, was a strong part of this identity. A second explanation comes from rational choice theory. This theory suggests that voters will vote for the party which best represents their interests. Therefore, middle class people are more likely to vote Conservative in this view, as Conservative policies of reducing taxes on the wealthy, for example, will benefit them more than Labour policies will. Likewise, working class voters are likely to vote Labour, as the traditional Labour policies of high public spending, generous welfare payments and trade union rights will benefit them. Of course, these 2 explanations are closely linked, as the reason voting Labour became part of one's working class identity is precisely because they had policies which benefited the working class. Now, this link between social class and voting behaviour, however, has been getting less and less pronounced ever since the 1980s. Since the 1980s, the UK has been undergoing a process of deindustrialisation, in which mining and manufacturing industries have been closed down or moved abroad. At the same time, there's been a rise of white-collar work, office work, and the service industry, such as retail. And this has arguably led to a weakening of class identity, as not only are these new industries less likely to be unionised, union membership has halved since the 1970s, but they're also less likely to foster a collective spirit and identity. And as a result, class consciousness has decreased and class has become less of a potent signifier of identity as it used to be. So as a result, there's also less attachment to the party which has historically represented that class. And this weakening of the link between social class and voting behaviour is known as class de-alignment, and it in turn has led to partisan de-alignment, where people feel less of an attachment to one particular party. And the result of all of this is that there's been a large increase in swing voters, as voting behaviour cannot simply be predicted on the basis of class so much as it used to be in the past. In the 2019 election, for example, there was no significant difference between the proportion of people voting Conservative across any of the social classes. And this has made elections a lot more volatile, with huge numbers of people now unsure how they will vote even on the day of the election. And arguably this has made short-term factors, such as leadership or media coverage, a lot more important in determining voting behaviour than they used to be. However, it may be too soon to write off class altogether. Whilst the correlation between voting behaviour and class may be weak when class is measured by the old sociological categories of classes A to E, it remains strong when defined according to ownership of property. In 2017, for example, whilst those who owned their own homes were 10% more likely than average to vote Conservative, those in rented accommodation were around 30% more likely than average to vote Labour. But class is not the only social group seen to be linked to voting behaviour. In terms of gender, women have been historically slightly more likely to favour Conservatives than men have, and slightly less likely to favour Labour. In 1970, for example, it was believed that housewives had swung the vote in favour of Edward Heath's Conservative Party, giving him his surprise victory over Harold Wilson's Labour Party. Now, two main theories have been advanced to explain this historic trend. The first is that women have been less likely to be involved in trade union activity than men. Now, this is partly because they were less likely to be in paid work at all, as they were more likely to be carrying out domestic and child-rearing work in the home, and partly because if they were employed, it was less likely to be in the heavily unionised industrial sectors, such as steel and mining. And it was through the working in these industries that men often came into contact with the politics of trade unionism, and through that the Labour Party. And so, being less exposed to these politics, women were less likely to develop an affinity with the Labour Party. The second theory is that women are more risk-averse than men. Being the ones historically with responsibility for feeding the family and running the home, they were seen as less likely to favour radical changes that might disrupt their ability to do this. This made them less likely to favour the radical economic policies traditionally associated with Labour, and so the theory goes, gave them more of a conservative temperament. And Heath specifically appealed to this temperament in the 1970 election with promises of economic stability and protecting the price of the weekly shop and so on. However, this historic trend for women to be more likely than men to vote Conservative, less likely to vote Labour, this historic trend went into reverse during the Blair years. Pause the video here, remind yourself, when were the Blair years? That is, when was Labour leader Tony Blair Prime Minister? Did you get it? 1997 to 2007. Now, during this period, women became slightly more likely to vote Labour than Conservative. And this trend has remained until today, but it's generally been a fairly weak trend, with women only marginally more likely to support Labour than men. And interestingly, in 2017, women were equally as likely to support Labour as they were Conservatives, but men were 6% more likely than women to vote Conservative. Now, one explanation for this is what's termed issue salience. Which issues have more salience, more resonance with voters' concerns, which is thought to vary across gender. In other words, women and men prioritise different things. Men are more likely to prioritise issues such as defence and national security, favouring things like nuclear weapons, armed forces and militarism, whereas women are more likely to prioritise health and education. Now, Jeremy Corbyn's long-held opposition to nuclear weapons and militarism, therefore, may have damaged his standing amongst men, but not so much about women, who aren't so concerned about those things. That's the theory. In the 2019 election, meanwhile, there was little overall difference between the voting habits of women and men, with women just 4% more likely to vote Labour than men, 4% less likely to vote Conservative, but there was much more of a pronounced difference between young women and young men. So in the 18 to 24 age group, 65% of women voted Labour, compared to only 48% of men. Think about that, 2/3 of young women, less than half of men. Interesting. Whilst only 15% of women in this age group voted Conservative, compared to 28% of men. Significant difference. In other words, amongst under 25s, men were almost twice as likely to vote Conservative as women. Now this brings us nicely onto age. With age, the trend has always been that older people are more likely to vote Conservative, with the young more likely to vote Labour. Now the Conservative explanation, of course, for this is that young people are naturally idealistic and unrealistic, but then they grow up, they come to their senses, give up this silly nonsense about changing the world, their wisdom and maturity kick in, they realise that radical attempts to change the world always end in disaster. And And this view is summed up in the phrase, if you're not a communist at age 20, you don't have a heart. If you're still a communist at age 40, you don't have a brain. Now, obviously, as a 42-year-old communist, I beg to differ, but that is the saying. Another explanation, however, is that as people get older, they tend to get more of a stake in society. They might get a career with their salary steadily advancing as they get older. They might buy a house. In other words, their class position improves. And they develop an interest in the status quo and keeping things as they are because the situation suits them quite well. So they get an interest in not rocking the boat. As they get wealthier, more tied to a mortgage, they're also more likely to favour things like lower taxes, traditionally associated with the Conservative Party. Yet another explanation is that as society progresses and becomes more tolerant, younger people are more exposed to these currents. As a result, they're less likely to be hostile to minority groups, more welcoming of diversity. In other words, less sexist, less racist, and less homophobic. Older people, meanwhile, are more likely to be, let's say, stuck in the values of the past, having grown up in a time when, for example, racial discrimination was legal and widespread, but homosexuality was a criminal offence. Their values were shaped in a very different era. And the Conservatives, seen as the party of traditional values, is therefore more likely to gain support from the older people still holding on to these attitudes. So this tendency for the young to vote Labour and the older to vote Conservative has always been the historic trend, but in recent years has become massively more pronounced, especially since 2010 and even more so since 2015. In 2010, for example, over 65s were about 7% more likely than the average voter to vote Conservative, and under 25s were about 9% more likely than the average voter to vote Labour. Fast forward to 2017, however, and over 65s were more than 30% more likely to vote Conservative than the average voter, with the under 25s more than 30% more likely to vote Labour. In fact, in 2017, whilst almost 70% of over 70s voted Conservative and less than 20% voted Labour, these figures were exactly reversed for the under 20s. For the under 20s, nearly 70% of them voted Labour and fewer than 20% of them voted Conservative. So you might think, therefore, that the votes of the more Labour-inclined younger generation and the votes of the more Conservative-inclined older generation might balance each other out. In fact, this is not the case. Pause the video here, remind yourself, or try and work out why is that not the case. It's not the case for two reasons. Firstly, because turnout is so much lower amongst younger people than older. And secondly, at the same time, we have an aging population with people living longer. So in other words, the proportion of voters, older voters, is growing each year. The proportion of the electorate that is in that over 65 age bracket is growing each year. But these trends mean that the propensity of older people to support the Conservatives and younger people to support Labour is of much greater benefit to the Conservatives than to Labour. The tendency of the elderly to vote and of the young to abstain, meanwhile, does tend to lead to policies that are skewed in favour of the old and against the interests of the young. University fees, for example, have been consistently rising, whilst pensions have been protected. Issues around youth unemployment, housing problems tend to receive little attention, as those the most affected are also the least likely to vote. So parties do not see it as in their political interest to address these concerns. And when they do, for example, under Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, they're punished electorally by elderly voters. So of all the factors we've looked at so far then, age is now considered to be the most significant, the one most likely to determine how a voter will vote, more important than gender or even class. Personally, however, I would suggest that this age difference is in fact also a class difference, because older voters can be seen in a way as forming a privileged class compared to the young. Many of them have benefited from free university education, they've held secure, well-paid jobs throughout their working lives, got good generous pensions, they own their own homes. Young people, meanwhile, face precarious employment, huge debts if they go to university, limited pension options, and next to no chance of buying their own house without help from their family. So older voters, forming a privileged class in society which benefits from the status quo, tend, unsurprisingly, to vote for the party of